I'm shocked that as we rocked, you didn't wear your new shirt.
Oh, you mean this shirt?
Yeah, this shirt. I bought it for you because your favorite band is Whitesnake. And
we went to the Whitesnake concert last Monday with Neil.
It was pretty great. Do you want to give a quick review of how that went?
Yeah, it was fun. Neil had a great time. We drank wine out of a water bottle. Mm-hmm. That was pretty solid. The drive there and back was amazing. The music was great too.
There were multiple times that I looked over at you and tears rolling down your cheeks, glistening. We were the two youngest people there.
By a country mile.
By a good mile.
It sort of reminded me, you remember in the movie I Love You, Man, when Seagal's character goes, I call these women Bowsers because they look exactly like their dog. A lot of women had that hair at the Whitesnake concert. It was kind of like the drummer's hair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a great scene. Live music is generally fun in most cases, and this was fun. The nice thing was that they knew it was a Monday concert, and they were like, all right, we're going to keep this nice and snappy, and they have bottles of wine for $26, which, if you were going to have an event, sell bottles of wine for $26. That is a good move. So I got you the shirt to commemorate that experience, and it's a child-friendly shirt, which is the best part about it.
Exactly.
So, all right, we're going to talk about the pass rush versus coverage.
Did you blot it out, Matt?
Yeah, you have to fuzzy it out. In just a second, if you haven't read it, now is a time to go read it. Just Google pass rush coverage PFF, and it was posted a couple days ago, and you'll want to read it before you listen to this so that you've got a sense of what we're talking about. First thing, though, you, in addition to loving Whitesnake, have a love for the Indianapolis Colts. Please explain.
I do. Well, I like the way that they're building their roster. I like the way, so we talked about last week, I believe, the trade back that they had that was, positive EV. I think we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, but this idea of taking advantage of some of the biases in the draft. So we kind of found at least multiple examples of teams without first round picks were then subsequently trading up in either the second or third round, the New Orleans this year, Chicago this year, Kansas City the last 2 years without a first round pick, sort of chasing in the subsequent years. So you find those biases with these teams that are waiting a day and a half to pick a player and want to just trade up 10 spots, and you sort of get them. So that was interesting. So I just they have 50 million or so, a little bit more actually in cap space. They didn't go all in on free agents. They got Justin Houston, Devin Funchess. They re-signed, I believe, Glowinski. They have a franchise quarterback. They traded back. They've gotten Rock Ya-Sin in the draft. I just like the way that they're positioning themselves in the AFC for when eventually the Patriots decide they're done.
You bring up the Patriots, and that's really interesting because when I see the way that the Colts are building their team, it reminds me a lot of how the Patriots do it. They're not going out making any huge splash plays. They've got a lot of players that know how to do their job. They've defined some roles that players can succeed in. Last year, the fact that their defense wasn't a total disaster was a complete shock. And a big reason for that is that they created a scheme and put players in a position to succeed. And if you just do that, and you have a really good quarterback, you're going to do really well.
You're going to have this baseline, it'd be a fixed cost, but in this case, it's a fixed benefit. You have a fixed benefit of 6.5, 7 wins just right off the top.
Right. And then you can go get spanked repeatedly in Kansas City.
Right. So, and that's again, I've talked about this, with you and also, on Kansas City radio. I think if you're a Chiefs fan, Chris Ballard, former Kansas City executive, sort of doing things a little bit differently than Brett Veach, who we worked with while in Kansas City, in the playoff game last year, we both predicted that, we had like the Chiefs first half over or something like that. Like we knew the Chiefs were going to sort of like, kill the Colts. But like the question was like 5 years from now, how does that power struggle play out? And I think right now, even though it pains me to say this, I think the Colts are going to me, I think they're the kind of the favorite to be the next Patriots, just because of all the things, like the quarterback, but also the coaches in place, the defense is, cheap and in place, and the offensive, the Frank Reich, the head coach and offensive coordinator, is like extremely good as well. So I don't know. It's kind of fun to look and kind of fun to predict. We'll see in 5 years from now how stupid I look.
Probably pretty stupid, but let's look at the other side of that, because a lot of people will say, well, Chiefs have Mahomes. You'd probably
do
rather
have Mahomes. That's true.
You'd rather have Mahomes than Andrew Luck. And there's a team that comes to mind. So you say, okay, the Colts are my favorite to be the next Patriots. Who are the Chiefs the next version of? Can you guess who I'm thinking of?
I think the Chiefs are the next Colts from Manning's era.
Interesting. Okay. I really like that. I was going to go with the Saints and Drew Brees, where they've got this amazing quarterback. They're probably always going to have a great offense.
You're going to spot 6.5, 7 wins, and sometimes no more if your defense is that bad.
And there were some low points for the Saints that the Chiefs probably can avoid just by virtue of not being a complete disaster. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting. We're going to talk about the pass rush versus coverage thing. If they just continue hemorrhaging points to other teams, it's going to be a real struggle for them.
The Chiefs have they're very much like the Saints in the offensive coordinator realm as well, or the head coach that calls plays realm.
Sure.
The Chiefs have a built-in advantage in the AFC West, in which their home games are played in Central Time Zone, and so the Raiders,
Missouri.
The Raiders, Chargers, and Denver all have to lose body clock time to play there. So it's an interesting built-in advantage for them. I don't see them being worse than 8-8 at any given time. But if you have Pat Mahomes and you go 8-8, that's a pretty big fail.
That's a huge failure. And the Tyreek Hill thing we can't gloss over. I don't know if we talked about this last week. Did we?
Tyreek Hill. We talked about the Chiefs Super Bowl odds going up or down a little bit, and the price going up a little bit.
That can't be ignored. I mean, the simple fact that it is really hard to get playmakers of that caliber. Mm-hmm. You can't expect Pat Mahomes to just absolutely annihilate the league as he did last year every single season. It is going to be tougher sledding depending on how things break that way. But that is you always want to try and find these teams a year in advance. You never want to be late to the show.
And I think we're a little late on the Colts. To be honest, though, like last season, we were banging the drum
we liked
for the
them
over.
Last year.
Yeah, we were banging the drum for the over.
They're a sneaky Super Bowl.
Yes, and last year they were a sneaky playoff team that we were talking about last year. I would say, though, like that's where I fall short. That's why I make the window a little bigger. I think that their Super Bowl odds and their win totals are a little inflated based upon their finish last year. I'm more looking at like kind of like the broad, like they're going to be a force in the AFC for a while, in my opinion.
Cool. All right, it's time for coverage versus pass rush. I would say 2 years ago, I'm living in D.C. You're over in the great frozen plains of La Crosse, Wisconsin. And most of our conversations were had online. And you and I were on the phone, and we were just sort of starting to get access to a lot of the play-by-play raw data, test out a bunch of different things that, we had always wanted to look at, right? I think we bonded over our desire to test these things out. And you posited the question, like, what do you think? Do you think pass rush or coverage is more important? And we had this debate. And I think both of us were like, it's tough. I think I'm going to have to side with pass rush.
Yep.
Let's find out. And 2 years later, we've had this debate 100 different ways with 100 different people. It is one of the more tenuous conversations out there because for ages and ages and ages, football has been won in the trenches, and the pass rush is a great example of that. And we just published this article where we really disseminate the findings and the different sides of the argument in as many ways as possible. So let's start at the very beginning with sort of the two prongs of how we can look at this, right? It's it's not just one measure. There's a couple of different measures for pass rush and coverage.
Yeah, I mean, so there's PFF grades, there's pressure, there's, passes broken up, passes influenced, there's PFF grades and coverage, there's PFF grades and coverage for individual players, there's PFF grades and coverage for teams. And, this is a more nuanced argument than do running backs matter or does the running game win football games? Because there are some things that pressure has for it. And I think this is a testament to the PFF grading system. Pass rushers grade really well the next year on average. The correlation coefficients are in pretty high relative to anything we look at. Whereas in coverage, it's not low. Like football, we're dealing with correlation coefficients that are in the 0.3s all the time. But that's how it is for coverage players. But ultimately, when you look at whether it's expected points, whether you look at its team wins, whether you look at success rate allowed defensively in the pass game, in fact, I actually looked at this earlier. Success rate allowed in the run game is more affected by coverage than run defense grades, right? So it's coverage is this thing that influences everything, and that's so if that's true, right? You could look backwards and say, okay, coverage explains what happened last year the best. That's somewhat unsatisfying because, as I wrote in the running backs article, if you look at a team that ran the ball extremely well one game, I'll go back and say the running back graded well. That doesn't mean the running back grading well affects, but then you try to project that forward and it's almost no correlation between how good the runner is and how good the running game will be. And so to the person that says, okay, but your grades and coverage are unstable, then okay, if they're explanatory but not predictive, there's a point. But they end up being predictive, right? The R squared is very non-trivially non-zero in the case of coverage, and actually near zero for pass rush. So that's where our conclusions are. And I think again we leave a lot of space in the article for this idea that we could do a better job of tracking coverage. We could do a better job of pinning down what these things are. But ultimately, right now, the way that we have it, as our friend Josh Hermsmeyer said on Twitter, the sausage is good.
We're just going to end there.
Yeah.
There are a couple things that are super important about this conversation that oftentimes lead people down the wrong path. And the first one is this. We often get caught up in the success of a player or the success of a unit and its ability to be successful again.
Yeah.
And that is what pass rush has going for it. We can do a better job of saying this pass rusher is going to be good next year, and this pass rush unit is going to be good next year. But that you don't get wins for accumulating sacks, right?
No.
And so the question of which one best predicts how many wins you will have is the important part of this conversation. And so pass rush, it doesn't not explain how many games you win the following season. It just doesn't do it anywhere near as well as coverage does. So that it shouldn't be formed in a binary fashion where coverage is all that matters, pass rush doesn't matter. Pass rush does matter, but coverage matters more and significantly more so. And so that is the first thing. And then I think the second part of this conversation is just because one matters more doesn't mean you can't still have a really good discussion about what do you do with that information? There's a whole team building conversation that I want to get into in a second. But then the next thing that I want to talk about, which is what is the relationship between pass rush and coverage? Because I think is one of the first things people bring up. And it's not impossible to test this out.
Right. So so just to get to the correlation perspective, we have looked at the play level as well. And a plus grade in coverage is just worth more from an EPA level. It is correlated with pass rush, but it's also reversely so, right? Yes. And the way that we watch the game, the broadcast angle, all that kind of stuff, the way that NFL Films has glorified the pass rush, the way that quarterbacks historically have been terrible and offenses have been terrible at dealing with them, in conjunction with the distribution of all pass attempts, which is skewing more towards first downs than it was historically. Pressure rates on first down are lower than that on third down. it's our bias that's coming in here. They are correlated, but you can make a significant argument to say that good coverage gives pass rush a little bit more time to get home, which in turn affects coverage, right? So that's like really the only loop where one of them shows up twice, and that it's coverage in that case. And yeah, we're more than open to the fact that if you pressure a quarterback, it's going to cause worse coverage on the back end to be more successful, but it's also the reverse. And so as we have sort of two causal, sort of hypotheses, you go to the data and say which one predicts better, and it ends up being coverage. And that's, to me, like that's the most level-headed approach to it. As long as you come back and do what we did, which is say, okay, let's contextualize this by saying we know that coverage is unstable. So if you're building a team, there is no guarantee that if you get 7 coverage players and you think they're all good, that you're going to be successful. What we're trying to say is, don't necessarily just build a pass rush and say we can scheme coverage later. That's not necessarily true either.
Well, and that was the broadcast thing is really fascinating. And that's the lens through which we watch the game. And so a lot of the way that we think about the game, and that's why the job of the telecast and the broadcast is so important, because they tell the story for you. And to, a guy like Fred Gaudelli, who we've had on the podcast and is an innovator in that realm, he loves the pass rush. Right? But he's done a great job of trying to show when coverage really matters, right? They have Coverage Sack on NBC Sunday Night Football. Now, we still don't get enough of it because of the angle of the normal view, but passing is now such a predominant part of the game on first and second down. EPA passing on first and second down so much higher than it is on third down. Pressure rates are lower. And so all of a sudden there's going to be a bigger and bigger emphasis on the only part of that the defense can really control, which is when a pass is coming out quickly, it's coverage. And so there are a lot of ways to bring up useful, understandable examples that don't involve correlation coefficients and predictability and all of this stuff to have this conversation. So before we get there, though, a friend of ours, Joe Banner, questioned the subjectiveness of the grades. And I went after him a little bit on Twitter. I'm not someone that does that very often.
No, you aren't.
That's not my thing. I'm never going to go after someone with, like 150 followers or, just someone that's angry. Not my style. The reason I got kind of hyped up about this is that Joe Banner is a guy who's been in a position of power. He has a fairly large following, and he's
not an idiot.
He's not an idiot.
Yeah.
And he's in a position to actually help the culture of growth and further learning and open-mindedness. And he came across, the way that he tweeted out about it was very closed-minded and appealing to authorities of institution and stuff like that. Yeah. Now, I've talked to Joe Banner. We've cleared the air. I've made an apology. He's made an apology. So we're not going to hate on Joe Banner here. But I want to address this question because Evan Silva had the same question for us, which is, okay, these grades are to a certain extent subjective as much as we have a rubric and stick to it. But that's not an issue.
Well, and here's the thing. So, and this is where having folks like us in the room and having folks like us on Twitter talk through these things is important, because like I'm a mathematician, you're a mathematician. Like we've dealt with, because, and this is all in all walks of life. If you're a Republican, if you're going to accept a Democrat, he or she has to be perfect at what they do. Yeah. The first thing that they do that they mess up, they're immediately disregarded. If you're an old school scout, to accept analytics would require analytics to be handed down to you from the hand of God, right? And that's unfair, right? Like, people who do math know that every single piece of data collected, like this isn't pure mathematics, we're proving theorems, and like they have no applicability to the world. We get to build the axiom system, which again, subjective. We're dealing with data, we're dealing with models, and we're dealing with data collection. Every single piece of data that's collected by a human or a computer, we look at ESPN's pass rush win weight, they have to determine how they classify a pressure, which is subjective, right? Like, so every single piece of data collection is subjective, and much like any other field, the only way to determine if it's valid is not to say subjective, objective. It's to test it statistically. And that's what we've done. It's the same thing. GPAs, we both taught. as I've taught, thousands of students, the GPA that a student has is a subjective measure of their performance.
Yes.
The ACT is a subjective measure of how smart a student is because you apply cultural effects into the test. You apply, you apply basically like which sort of like questions are weighted more than other questions. Like, every single thing is subjective. What you have to do is you have to see if there are statistical signals within them.
The yards, I'm going to go all the way, right? I bet you many people would say, no, yards are objective. No, they're not.
Brian Burke showed that referees put the ball at 5-yard increments at higher rates than the other 4 yards in that interval.
Subjective. We give yards to certain players subjectively, right? If I came up to you and I said, hey, I had this this is just me, my intuition on every play telling you how well the players do, and it predicts wins better than anything else. Guess what? You don't care that it's my subjectiveness. Everything is subjective, and what really matters is whether it's hard. You can't subjectively come up with a measure that's predictive.
Yeah.
Try, right? Like that is the goal of PFF, honestly, is to best nail down the process because we believe the process is more predictive
and then you
than
use
the result.
And then you use the power of large samples, use the power of consistency, and in some cases, because PFF has been around so long that our grading system before we had team clients, before we had media clients, is a little different in 08 than it is in 17, 18, and 19. You use statistical techniques to adjust for year.
Yep.
Like those exist, right? And the fact of the matter is again, like maybe we as a community need to be less hard on scouts, but it's sort of the same thing, right? Scouts provide their objective measure. Now, what we may not have done a great job at either as a football community and we don't have access to their grades and stuff, so it's not our fault as an analytics community. But the thing is like scouts' grades are subjective, but I would bet my life on the fact that there's predictive power in them, right? So it's the same thing. It's the difference between PFF and maybe scouts grades is scouts are basically assigning one number once to a player based upon processes that may or may not be the most robust, whereas we're applying multiple numbers on a player with a process that we think is becoming more robust, and we're doing it a lot of times, and we allow the things like the central limit theorem to go to put into play.
There. You're gonna bring up the birthday problem again?
Yeah,
we should do a podcast with the birthday problem.
But again, like this idea of subjective measures is not something that is not like
it's not prohibitive. That's
you have to see how good the predictive power of things are before you dismiss them.
And this is what got me so angry about what Joe Banner said is that he had some tweet to the effect of it's subjective. I've worked with people from MIT and Penn. They'll tell you that you have to throw out all of that. And any mathematician that you talk to will simply tell you that that is flat out incorrect for all of the reasons that you mentioned.
I would venture to guess there are a couple things are true about what he said. I tweeted out the percentage of first down plays that are runs the other day. I could tweet out the percentage of first down plays that have pressure. Like, he was the GM until 2012.
Right.
If this study was done on data up until 2012, the conclusion very well could be different because the league has evolved so much in a decade. The other thing that's probably true is that the person's conclusions were misinterpreted. We've had that happen in our building a ton, like where we either it's our fault for not stating our uncertainty or it's their fault for misinterpreting it. But like, I can almost guarantee you that like something, was being misapplied in this particular instance.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's jump into what I think is the fun part of this conversation. Want to break down for some people a useful interpretation of why this is the case, right? So how do I wrap my head around coverage being more important to winning games than pass rush is? And to me, it comes down to the way that the game is played today, the quickness of throws, the ability to mitigate a pass rush with a quarterback that knows what he's doing, and the ultimate goal of winning a Super Bowl, going through those good quarterbacks. The only place where you can actually make the biggest impact is if you're the quarterback throwing or you are at the point where the catch needs to be made, and that's where coverage comes into play. And then I'm going to let you have your time in just 1 second. The last thing that I have to add on there is that I think the conception or the perception, sorry, of what happens when you have a great pass rush or a bad pass rush versus a great coverage play or a bad coverage play aren't always considered. So a great pass rush, okay, you could get a sack. You might not, though, because a quarterback can throw it quickly.
Yep.
Okay. Now, if you have a bad pass rush, okay, but you don't have a chance at a sack, but there's still another line of defense.
Yes.
Now, on the coverage side, if you make a great coverage play, 0 yards or an interception. If you make a bad one, you're probably getting roasted. So to me, those things can help you wrap your mind around.
You have to make the argument that if they're both true at the endpoints, that somehow there's some cross.
Right. You have to really jump across a very large river to make that assumption.
And we said this on the video with Steve and Solomon, but like the fact is like and we wrote about this in the article. This was part of the refrain that we had. Defenses have far less control about what happens than they think, right? Like even coverage. So we look at it, coverage can explain, basically like 10% of EPA allowed defensively in the pass game 1 year to the next. Pass rush does none, right? But you're not talking about a ton of predictability here. And the thing is the one place where you are able to be on the offensive defensively is by forcing the quarterback to do things he doesn't want to do, which is hang on to the ball in many instances, right? If the quarterback wants to avoid your pressure, he can. He can do what Brady did against the Chargers. He can do what Brady did against
And I wouldn't make that
Kansas City.
absolute. I would, sometimes you just can't.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, the large sample, you can.
You put the offense on the defensive when you can stop their receivers from getting open early. And like we looked at and that's what Belichick values. When he had Brandon Browner, he had one job, and that was to win in the first 2 seconds of a play. Like he obviously has Gilmore and all those folks. But again, coverage is the way that you put your defense on the offensive. And that's offensive to many people because when we watch the game of football, we like my favorite Viking player for a long time, Chris Dolman, was like a pass rush extraordinaire, right? And I just thought he affected offenses so much, right? But it was really Carl Lee and all these other guys in the background giving him that extra half a second to get to the quarterback. And it's just really interesting to think about it that way.
One of the things that I also like to look at is what is the benefit of being in rhythm? And our buddy Zach Robinson, who's now the assistant coach for our other buddy, Sean McVay, over in Los Angeles, when he put together this quarterback charting process with Steve, they made sure that they tracked in-rhythm throws. And because Zach is so attuned to the quarterback position, he was able to make this rubric for that. And essentially, it's when the back foot hits, are you able to go where you want to go, or one hitch, go where you want to go? And so quarterbacks throwing in rhythm, being able to go where they want, even when they're under pressure, generates more value on an EPA per play basis than being in a clean pocket, no pressure, but not being able to throw in rhythm, right? So what might make that happen is good coverage. You can't go where you want to go with the ball. And to me, that is a nice way of sort of summing it up. Let's close out with, or do you want to make one more point?
Well, so it was interesting. Yesterday we were talking to Bruce Gradkowski, who is
another
replacing Zach. Yeah. And he said something interesting.
Don't worry, Zach. No one can ever replace him.
That's true. Not in our hearts. So he said something great. He said, oftentimes in quarterback play, being decisive is better than being right. And again, being unable to be decisive is a way in which the defense puts themselves in an offensive position. And because we know offense matters so much in the NFL, that's how you win, right? In addition to being able to take advantage of the few mistakes that the Bradys and the Mahomes make.
Well, that's the other thing too, is when you practice, most people are practicing their optimal situation.
Yep.
When you take them out of that optimal situation, they all of a sudden have less practice hours with that. Like there's many ways to think about it. What I want to close this out with is the really interesting question here, which often even people who can grasp and are on board with coverage being more important have a hard time with, which is, how do I apply this to team building? And we are in lockstep with how we do this, but often even people in our own building are like, you're kind of crazy with that. So from a draft perspective, from a free agency perspective, there's a couple things that are really important. And just because pass rush is stable. Just because we're better at predicting that pass rushers are going to be good, and we're not good at predicting that coverage guys are going to be good relative to that, doesn't mean that we just avoid coverage guys because we don't know. It actually means the opposite. You need more coverage players to be successful. That's one thing. And because you're not as sure, you need to take that many more shots. It doesn't change. Coverage is still going to be valuable, whether you pick coverage players or not. So the idea that you would all of a sudden pick pass rushers at the top of the draft because you're more sure they're going to be good gets back to where we started with this, which is you don't get wins for picking good players.
Well, that was like the refrain from the Barkley folks. The Giants, Giants fans wanted a trophy for having an all-pro running back, right? And like, you don't get one, right? You don't get one for having. And
we are a pro Saquon Barkley podcast.
We are.
I want to make that very clear.
We are. He's great.
He and I have the same outfit, by the way, this past weekend.
You don't get a trophy for, and like defensive ends are like these, like if you look at Danielle Hunter, right? Like he's a specimen, right? So you want those type of guys on your football team, right? But like the fact is we know actually that there's another side of the stability issue. The other side of the stability issue is if a guy's a good pass rusher in college and he's being undervalued somehow in the marketplace, you can get him in the 3rd, 4th round, a la Danielle Hunter, a la Carl Lawson, Trey Flowers, Grady Jarrett, et cetera, that you don't have to reach, right? And much like your issue with the Niners taking McGlinchey, one of the things also is you have a winner's curse. If you hit on a pass rusher, you're going to have to pay him, money very similar to DeMarcus Lawrence, money very similar to Khalil Mack, and that's a curse, right? That's a winner's curse to some degree. So, we're not necessarily against taking a pass rusher if the marginal value is so much higher, right, than other places. But what we are saying is like you need to shoot a lot of shots with respect to the defensive backfield. And what's a beauty about it is that defensive backs can make a lot of valuable contributions in many different ways. You can have a deep safety. You can have a safety who plays strong safety in slot. You can have a safety who plays linebacker and strong safety. You can have outside corners, inside corners, corners that can do both. A pass rusher can really, if he stinks at pass rushing, there's not really a whole lot more you can do with him.
People are going to hear this and they're going to say, you hate pass rushers.
No.
It's not the case at all. Make sure that you read the article.
Pro Danielle Hunter podcast.
Make sure that you read the article. And if you have questions and you want to dive in, this is an awesome place to do so because it's still certainly an open question. And if there's one thing that I want to make sure people come away with, it's that is our stance. So let us know if you've got any even-toned questions for the pod, and we'll be happy to bring them up next week. Speaking of questions for the podcast, we have a question for us from the dark web. It brought to us, of course, by Sampo Ranta, sparkling water for men.
Finally.
Flavor
looking out for us.
Flavor for this off season. This week of the off season, which is kind of a dead one. They actually took. They have to look at other sports sometimes to come up.
Okay.
They realize that we're from other sports. So it's spousal insecurity strawberry, with just a hint of maybe the tides will turn at some point. And I don't know who I'm talking about. You might be able to figure it out. But look, if you're a little insecure there because your husband or significant other plays a professional sport at a very high level and is very highly paid in, say, California, the northern part, you may be insecure. Grab yourself a Sampo Ranta. Question comes from @903124S. Is there any way to tell which receiver has created more separation with respect to their air yard? So this is off the back end of a discussion about what's the most important thing that a receiver can do.
It's the ability to run rub routes
and
screens for the win.
And we're on the, a lot of people that are on the same side, but it's that separation is really what wins in the NFL.
That's how you separate yourself.
Generating open throws, whether it be by scheme or with the receiver, is going to greatly help your offense. Open throws, step or more separation, basically doubles your expected yards output relative to other types of separation. So the question here is, which receivers are getting more separation, creating, look, we'll discuss that in a second, but which receivers are getting more separation further down the field, right, when their depth of target is down the field. And so just to look at this, guys who created the most open throws at or past the line to gain, a shocking group here. Tyreek Hill.
Purveyor of rub routes, Tyreek Hill.
Tariq Cohen, who just barely squeaks in the target threshold. He really probably shouldn't be in this group. Sammy Watkins, Tyler Lockett, Kiki QT. And the interesting thing that sticks out to me here are a couple of Chiefs and guys who are fast.
Yep. Kiki QT, not that this is a fantasy podcast, but when I do my my play drafts, my my best balls, I take Kiki QT every freaking time. It's free advice. Take it.
The other thing is that Tyreek Hill could be in part a product of a great scheme, but also a creator or allower of that scheme to be great.
Sometimes it's both.
And I think the fact that Sammy Watkins is in there is also very interesting, right? Is it just the scheme? Is it just Tyreek Hill? No, it's probably a little bit of both. But that's a broad answer to that question.
Yeah, that's a great example of how, and I hate to continue to do this, but it's a great example of how great Andy Reid is.
This is fair. All right, we're going to close it out with a season review / look ahead, hopefully more of a look ahead for the Miami Dolphins.
Oh, yeah, this is our hot take of the week. So we've had a week of hot takes, but I feel like this is the scorchingest.
Okay.
Oh, I think the Miami Dolphins, our team of the week, have benefited from the AFC East more than any team in the league, including the Patriots.
That's a very hot take. Please continue.
Well, because people always give the Patriots crap because they win all these games because they got 6 games a year in the AFC East, and they don't look at the fact that they normally beat the other teams too. Mm-hmm. Kansas City being one of them. I think they lost to Pittsburgh this year, but whatever. The Dolphins, 7-9 a season ago. If you just added up their team wins from a WAR perspective, they had 2.75 wins. Our team full of replacement players is 3 wins, meaning their average player was a below replacement level player last year, and somehow they won 7 games. In 2017, they went 6-10. They had about 3.76 WAR wins. And in the Gaze's first year of 2016, when they went 10-6, they lost in the playoffs to Pittsburgh. They had 6.74 wins. How does that happen? You know how it happens. It happens because you are not a very good team, but because you play 4 games against other teams that aren't very good, you can get home. Because New England doesn't have these huge discrepancies between, like, you add up their wins and, like, this is kind of a measure of luck, right? If your team's full of wins but you don't win, you were unlucky. Your team's not full of wins, you get a bunch of wins, you were lucky. There's some coaching element to it. So do we look at Gaze and think of Gaze as better than he is? Kind of, but for me, it's looking at basically, like, does your schedule give you an opportunity to be lucky a lot? And I think in the case of the Dolphins, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to flip the script on this one. I think that you are correct, and ultimately that has really hurt the Miami Dolphins.
Sure, in terms of actually getting something...
Of actually being a viable franchise that is competing for anything worth anything.
Right. The worst thing that could happen really to you is the 2016 year for the Dolphins, in that you're bad. And Buffalo in 2017. The worst thing that can happen to you often is being bad, but having, like, 2016... my Detroit Lions, et cetera, et cetera. I do agree. Like that is a good point. And
because I think you're spot on. And when you said this to me, I had the same reaction, which was I actually think that's really hurt them because, look, they're a terrible team and they're not getting that much better. Although we're going to talk about this in a second, they may have been able to sort of swindle an extra top 10 pick, right, with the Rosen deal. So tides could be turning despite this.
The Dolphins last season were 7-1 in 1-score games and 0-8 in games decided by 9 points or more.
Is that good?
It's not great, Bob. We have we talked a couple weeks ago about the Dallas Cowboys under. They're very similar in the sense that Dallas a season ago was they were 1-3 in games decided by, more than a score. And, sort of all their games are sort of clustered in this could go either way type of situation. That's why they're more of an 8-8 team than the 10-6 team they purported to be last year.
Let's talk about their future prospects a little bit, and let's start with Rosen here. So the Rosen thing we've talked about a lot, but let's start from this perspective. If we had a team we were in charge of and we needed a quarterback, or even if we didn't really need a quarterback, where would we value Josh Rosen? What would we have given up for Josh Rosen?
A lot more than Miami gave up for him. There were rumors that Miami was going to give up 48 for him. And ultimately, and we talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, they were able to get New Orleans to chase, right? New Orleans without a first-round pick. They got New Orleans to trade up from 62 to 48, a 52.5% win for the Dolphins if you assume any position there, a over 60% chance if you assume a quarterback is picked there, which it eventually was with Rosen being the 62nd pick. A great move for Miami. I think it really does show in many ways that they're sort of building anew and in terms of process. Now we have to obviously determine whether or not this is noise or just one team making a bad decision by definition means the other team made a good one. So, but this was certainly a good process, I think, for the Dolphins.
I've brought this up many times when talking about Rosen, but I will do it again because I think it is useful and instructive. When we project quarterbacks from college to pro, the biggest factor is the situation in which they enter. And we have seen countless times where a very terrible situation draws out the worst in a quarterback that probably isn't very terrible. Case in point, the Rams with Jared Goff in his rookie year. And the similarities there are very stark. To begin with, the kind of what these quarterbacks bring coming out of college was, look, they could make the big throws that are there. Yep. They can put them on the money. They'll sit back in the pocket and they'll dice you up. And with that comes what happens if that pocket doesn't exist? So in terms of quarterbacks that have faced the highest rate of pressure in under 2.5 seconds. So you think about the things that you really just can't control.
Yep.
And you're a rookie quarterback. Jared Goff, 27%. Josh Rosen, 26.7%. Both top 10 figures in PFF history. And those numbers just aren't going, you're not going to sit under pressure as a rookie that much in less than 2.5 seconds and be successful. So to me, the situation is, it's going to be very different because you can't help but not be a 10 worst pass protection team in the entire history of the NFL.
Yeah, and they didn't do a ton in terms of in free agency of upgrading their offensive line, but they did in the draft. They got Michael Dieter from Wisconsin, Isaiah Prince from Ohio State in rounds 3 and 6. So they're certainly in addition to Christian Wilkins, a defensive tackle from Clemson, they really did do a good job of sort of fortifying the interior. They did not have Ted Larson last year was their second least valuable player, a quarter a win-loss versus replacement. He's gone. That should be just an addition by subtraction. Mike Gesicki is a rookie tight end. Will probably get better. So he's going to get a better situation. But at the same time, the Miami, the offense was 29th in pass offense and defense EPA. So this is a team that needed to rebuild.
Sure.
And the thing with Rosen is what's interesting is, this is sort of like a no-risk situation for them. He gets to play. If he struggles, they'll probably do a pretty good job of being able to see if he's worthy of being that quarterback in the future. If he's not, they're going to get another opportunity. And they didn't trade. They didn't move up for one of these quarterbacks last year, so they're going to have their full allotment of draft picks plus a 2020 second-round pick from New Orleans next year to have some ammunition to get the quarterback should Rosen not work.
Josh Rosen and the Cardinals last season generated nearly 10% fewer open throws than the league average.
Yeah,
that's bad, right? Their scheme was an absolute disaster. Yeah. I mean, they had Mike McCoy, who has been a bottom of the barrel offensive coordinator by our rankings for a while. They then throw poor Byron Leftwich in there. They have their best offensive weapon, which is David Johnson, whose best offensive component is his ability to actually get downfield and catch passes, running the ball straight up the middle over and over again. Rosen is in third downs that he has just absolutely no shot of succeeding on. So I am throwing that out. The only thing that happens is you have one less year on his contract. Is that big of a loss? No, not really. Right? What you have is an asset that was valued as a top 15 player, and that valuation should not all of a sudden go out the window. So the Dolphins, I think you can't help but say things are really pointing in the right direction, especially because, as you mentioned, they play in the AFC East. So they are going to have an opportunity to, they're not going to reach the Patriots level, but to vault very quickly if Josh Rosen turns out to be a decent quarterback.
Well, and we know that the wide receiver position is a big deal. Albert Wilson was the most valuable player on the Dolphins last year, despite missing a ton of games. What does he do? He takes short passes. He turns them into big gains. Kenny Stills as well, one of the top graded guys. So there are some pieces in place for Miami. They were good in many ways because their quarterback position was bad, but the shorter passes, Kenyon Drake against the Patriots, everybody will remember, but Albert Wilson against the Bears, Kenny Stills against the Raiders, for example. Like they have Jakeem Grant as also another like big playmaker. They re-signed the Devontae Parker, who I think has shown something at times. So their receiving core is not terrible. Again, if they can get some protection up front, if they can get some positive game scripts, which I think was one of Gaze's best traits, was that they were in a lot of games. And so like they never like put Tannehill in a position to look absolutely dreadful, except for maybe week 17 where he had them against Buffalo, which was a big L. But they're going to be an interesting team here. They're over under for wins as of a couple days ago, but 4.5. I've seen it at 5 as well, but the 4.5 is going to cost you about $1.50. Our number is more around 6 for a lot of the reasons you said, which is, look, they gotta they could win these games against Buffalo and New York Jets. Although both of those teams think they're better too, so they could also lose all 4 of those games. But where do you stand?
I hate having to eat all that juice. I mean, that is a lot, but you are going to luck into 4 wins. So I think you have to take the over there. And it's not my favorite thing in the world. I'm not rushing to the casino to place that bet, but I think you've just got to look at it from, if they win 4 games, they're, probably one of the worst 2 teams in the NFL. Do you really think they're one of the worst 2 teams in the NFL? I don't think you.
The only variable here is whether or not they are tanking. Like, because that would be. And I have
where do you stand on that?
Well, so we talked about this before the draft. I'm less inclined to believe that they're tanking this year because
they have a new coach.
They have a new coach. We saw it with Buffalo, right? Like you can't just turn the switch off, right? In Buffalo with McDermott's first year as well. But it is tough, right? Because you wonder in those late season games, if they're at 5-10 in week 17 or so, that would be over. But like, let's say ththey're 3-10, 3-11, all those, you got to get them to 2 more wins. Are they going to have the will, sort of like are they going to like shut guys down on IR late in the season? They're not going to try to lose games, but the question is are they really trying to win them? Given the price, it wouldn't be one of the top 10 win totals I would bet on, but if you're inclined to, I would. This is an implicit bet against the Jets and the Bills, and I like the latter a lot. And so that would be my lean. There. Yeah, obviously, the Super Bowl, there's plus 1,250, so that's probably too much.
It's gonna be a no for me.
Or 12,500. Sorry, and so that's too much. But their strength of schedule is pretty easy, 20th in PFF ELO. So. Yeah, if you're so inclined, it's not terrible.
Offense is faced. They got Brian Flores in there. All of a sudden, they pick things up there. What is your over/under for number of meaningful snaps for Ryan Fitzpatrick?
Oh, meaningful? 0.5.
Ooh.
But I do think he gets play, but But there's like almost no incentive to play him because you're not trying to win. You're not like Tampa where Dirk Cutter's trying to win, and you're not. And Rosen, like, for all of his faults last year, didn't get hurt despite all that nonsense.
It's actually impressive.
So I think Tannehill's probably on the bench, or sorry, not Tannehill. Fitzpatrick's on the bench. Tannehill as well is on the bench, but in Tennessee. So I think that he doesn't play a whole lot.
Anything else with the Dolphins? I think that's
I think, like I said, I think this is a team that, a couple of years from now, we're going to wonder what this all meant, right? Like what this time in their history all meant.
I think the Christian Wilkins pick was interesting. I'm assuming they didn't have any takers for it.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't feel like they're a D tackle away.
The league's opinion of Dwayne Haskins is interesting because he was there at 13.
Right.
Dolphins did not take him. They took a defensive tackle instead. No one traded up for that spot, which means either the Dolphins' price was too high or no one wanted it.
Yeah,
that's a pretty interesting pretty interesting outcome.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it gets back to what we've talked about a lot today, which is this player could be successful, but might not necessarily translate to wins on the field. Let's close it out with a little Cincy YMCA talk here.
Oh, yes.
We had a little time away from the gym because of travel, and we had a swim Thursday once again today, and the sauna the steam room.
Oh, you picked a different story than I was going to, so I got one too.
Perfect. The steam room at the Y in Cincinnati is generally pretty decent as long as you turn it on. The issue is that it's a little small, so you're in some close quarters. So we're in there today, and generally I think the etiquette is you sort of,
keep to yourself.
Keep to yourself, yeah. We had a couple of bros come in with some essential oils, eucalyptus. And they got a little excited about their eucalyptus oils. They asked the group that was in there if they could put some eucalyptus in the steam pipe. Of course, no one cared, and so they just went to town with a little eucalyptus in the Cincy YMCA. This isn't necessarily me hating on that. I just think steam room etiquette is an interesting one.
Yeah. I thought you were going to go with like Monday this week when we got done working out and we were talking about, I believe it was Sean McVay, which, sorry, Sean, but an old guy, half dressed, comes over, decides he needs to weigh in, literally, and comes over and says, you take an average peewee coach here in Cincinnati. He's a better coach than some of these NFL guys. And to that, I tell any coach that's listening to this, we don't think that.
Did you say anything? I remember just laughing.
I think we literally both just walked out on him.
Yeah.
Like we were the hell are you talking about?
There's some great takes out there. I still remember when we were visiting here before the Baker Mayfield draft and we got a Browns fan.
The Uber to Neil's house.
Uber for an hour told us about Josh Allen and winning with defense, and
you can get corners anywhere.
It was pretty great. I don't think I have any other Cincy Y stories. It's been
pretty.
To go buy some lavender, some eucalyptus. Start walking around the gym, dropping essential oils around. Anyways, check out the pass rush versus coverage article. We've got a little roundtable discussion with our buddy Solly Wilcox, who is in the building today. And if you've got questions for next week, hit us up. Enjoy your summer. Peace out.